Welcome to In the Telling. I'm Stephen G. Fullwood.
And I'm Miranda Mims, and we are the co-founders of the Nomadic Archivist Project.
Join us twice a month for stories about the Black family experience from people just like you. Family lore, saving personal and family records, connecting family stories to local, national, and international histories, researching archival institutions, loss and grief, physical and spiritual spaces, and so much more. As we all know, the world has been dealing with the devastating impact of the COVID-19 virus. In this difficult time, we at NAP sincerely hope that you and your families and loved ones are safe and sound. NAP is still offering our scholarship and has extended the application deadline, Thursday, April 30th, 2020. In the event that the Society of American Archivists decides to cancel its annual conference, NAP is considering alternative ways we can support individuals in their professional development, including membership dues, course registrations, travel costs, and projects. Please check our website for updates.
I would like to welcome our guest today, Alexis De Veaux. Alexis was born and raised in Harlem. She is the product of two merging streams of Black history in New York City. Immigrants from the Caribbean on her mother's side and migrants from North Carolina on her father's side, both who settled in Harlem in the early decades of the 20th century. The second of 8 children, that history was embedded in her mother's view of life, as she would say, quote, "You got 3 strikes against you, you poor, you Black, and you female," end quote. But Alexis was drawn to the world of words and books, and literature soon became the means by which she reimagined the world her mother understood. She is the author of many books, including Namni, Spirits in the Street, Blue Heat, a portfolio of poems and drawings, Don't Explain, a Song of Billie Holiday, Warrior Poet, a biography of Audre Lorde, and her most recent book, Yabo. We are very excited to have you here with us on In the Telling. Welcome, Alexis.
Thank you, Miranda, and thank you, Stephen.
And we're really excited to have you here with us, Alexis. I want to begin by talking with you about your family. I have a couple questions to sort of get us started here.
Mm-hmm.
Like when I spoke with you this past week to get a sense of the kind of story that you wanted to tell, it's obviously, like all family stories, very nuanced and in progress.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things that struck me is, like, when we talk about our biological family, how does one negotiate grief and loss? This is one of your comments, questions rather, and how to do that as a queer person.
Mm-hmm.
And so I guess I'll start with, where did you grow up?
I grew up in Harlem during the 1950s and 60s. I was born in 1948, so I was a baby basically in the 1950s. I was coming of age, I think, as a teenager by the 1960s. I grew up in a Harlem that was identified as a ghetto, which is a very different Harlem, I think, than the Harlem that we're looking at today.
Mm-hmm.
So I came to understand Harlem both from the sociological construct of the ghetto, which is externalized, and also from the internalized construct of this is where we live. We meaning Black people of all kinds. Black people who were from the South, who were from the North, who were coming from Africa, who were coming from the Caribbean. So the Harlem that I grew up in was definitely poor, definitely underserviced as a community in terms of what the city thought of us and therefore what was available to us. It was definitely overrun with power struggles between those of us who had and those of us who did not. And it was a Harlem that Malcolm X proliferated in. So, and in fact, the first time, maybe the only real time I saw Malcolm X was he was preaching from a soapbox on 116th Street and Lenox Avenue. And I was terrified because I had never seen or had known of a Black person who could talk the way he did in front of white people, meaning the cops. who surrounded us. So he was both enlightening and terrifying. But this was my Harlem. And that's what my Harlem was, enlightening and terrifying.
What was your home like inside the house?
We were, my mother raised 8 of us by herself, essentially. We were on welfare. We lived out a notion of being poor, of not having much. You know, we did have at one time radio and then ultimately television. So there were things that you could compare yourself to. Okay. Mm-hmm. And you could see that quote unquote white people certainly had more. Mm-hmm. And they lived in the suburbs. That whole Leave It to Beaver kind of reality that we were watching on TV, or mm-hmm. Father Knows Best, where the white parents took care of the white children, the white mother stayed at home, the white father went to work. Whatever he worked at, he certainly was successful at. He wasn't coming home complaining about bills, and they weren't getting welfare. So we knew, just in terms of the social indicators that were coming at us, whether it was television, whether it was newspapers, whether it was school system, we knew that we were differentiated both by color and by class. Home was largely negotiated around those kind of conditions. And for me, it was negotiated around being the child in that brood who, from my point of view, was really different. My interests were different. My sensitivities were different. My intellect was different. And so I grew up understanding that I was outside, even within my own biological family. Mm-hmm. As I developed and grew older and came to see myself as an artist, I got some understanding of that, but that also created even more tension for me with different siblings.
Interesting. And even with the siblings, you were second, correct? Second oldest?
I was second to the eldest, right. And I actually never wanted to be the eldest. I always thought that was a lot of work because, you know, the eldest had to step in for the mother when the mother wasn't present. And also the eldest appeared to me to have, to sacrifice so that the rest of us could have. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And I never thought that was my, that I was going to do well at that. Okay. But then when my oldest sister died in 1983, her name is Rosetta De Veaux. She died of complications due to AIDS. She was amongst the few Black women and women of color who were identified in the 1980s as, you know, victims of the disease. There was really literally no attention paid to women, and certainly not Black women of color. In any event, she, when she died, I became then the eldest living child. Mm-hmm. And I began to understand, to some degree, I think, what that meant to be the one who was oldest and who therefore needed to have a sense of everybody else.
Right.
Okay.
And before your sister passed, what was your relationship like with her, and in the context of taking care of the rest of your other siblings?
You know, I never took to rules and regulations very much, so I think it was harder for her. You know, I was not the one, although I was the one who would tell on everybody else. Like if our mother went out, I would report on who did what when she came back. So I was always the one telling the stories. But I was not, you know, I think for my sister, it was hard for her to manage us all. Also because she contracted polio early in life. So she was what we would call today disabled. And so her body was obviously different. And if she were sitting here telling the story, it probably would be a different story, deeply different from her point of view. I would say that we all understood each other as brothers and sisters, but we were never, ever really openly loving and affectionate with each other.
Okay.
And I think that had to do with the fact that our mother was also not an open, loving, affectionate person.
Okay.
She would say more often than not, she would, if you tried to cozy up to her on the couch, she'd push you away and say, get away from me, get off of me. So that meant that we were growing up with someone who was not teaching us how to do certain kinds of emotional work.
And speaking of emotion, you and I spoke about grief and loss. We talked about Renee.
Yeah.
And I wanted to know if you would sort of kind of talk a little bit about Renee and your relationship, but also about her passing. And how it impacted you.
Well, to be honest, I cannot say that I liked my sister. I can't go there. So my grief for her is not on a level of longing. My grief around her is just the hole that her death left in the family. As the three deaths of three sisters, the oldest sister, Rosetta, my youngest sister, Tanya, passed away in 2005 of a brain aneurysm she was not aware of. She passed away 4 months to the day of my partner of 22 years. And then Renee passed away a couple of years ago. Renee died of, from the coroner's point of view, she died of arterial sclerosis, which was she actually died in her sleep in her apartment, alone. And by the time we got the coroner's report, we came to understand that she basically died of heart failure. One of my brothers thought that she died of heartache, of a broken heart. And, as I said, I can't say that I was close to Renee because I wasn't. By the time she grew up or was coming up, I was already out of the house. And also, we just lived very different lives. She lived more in the street. I lived more in the library. I lived more at school, and she lived more in the detention center. Yeah, she was in the Bronx at the Spotfoot Home for Children a couple of times. She had a much rougher life than I did.
Okay.
I just think that our personalities weren't really, we just weren't close. So when she died, I didn't miss her that way. I don't miss her that way. I miss and mourn and grieve for her on the level that, as I said, the whole that gets created both in oneself and in the family when the ordinal numbers change. And when you try to fill that hole by becoming someone else. So when Renee passed away, unlike my other two sisters, I actually tried to externalize my grief by making something for her.
Okay.
For Rosie, I delivered a poem at her funeral. For Renee, I delivered a poem at her funeral. For Renee, I actually made what I call a book state. And book states are these tiny little installations that I make that generally speak to some literary moment or some literary quote.
Okay.
In the case of Renee, who was a lifelong smoker, who knew that it was terrible for her to continue smoking, who had been told that, who just stopped taking her heart medication, just stopped taking care of herself. Her book state is called The Surgeon General Declares.
Oh.
And it's basically a box that I made for Renee. And it has a crushed pack of Cools on one side and a heart that looks kind of opaque. And it's really like a funeral box. When it opens, there's a photo of Renee.
Okay.
And there's also a copy of the coroner's report, which says that she died of arteriosclerotic cardiovascular disease, and that her decomposing body was found at the residence. So that, making this book state helped me to come to terms with the fact that both she was gone and also that we weren't close. And I think that sense of not being close in grief is something that we don't really get to talk about a lot. We often make saints out of the people who leave us. We do not often think about the totality of who they were in their own lives and who they were to us. So for me, in terms of Renee and what I understood, it was important to try to make art out of something that had, on many levels, baffled me, and also just was not very close or tender.
Alexis, you mentioned that when someone dies, you feel like the hole that they leave forces others in the family to become somebody else. Can you explain what you meant by that?
Yeah, I hope that I can. I think, well, I won't try to speak for my remaining sisters and brothers, so I'll just speak for myself. For me, I think the hole never fills up. You can step into that person's ordinal position, but they're still there. Do you know what I mean? My sister is still my mother's oldest child. She's just not the oldest living child. So I feel haunted by, in the best sense of the word, haunted. I feel haunted by her presence, not by her absence. And I think that's true for each of the sisters that I've lost. So the hole is both filled by the next one moving up and also filled by the person who's gone.
Okay.
Do you see any connection between, and I'll just say your sisters and your mother and yourself? Is there something that sort of connects you all?
Our mother is the matriarch. There's no question about that. She is our family's matriarch. And we all had different fathers. So, and she was very clear with us. We could not call each other stepsister or stepbrother. She was totally against that. And she gave us, in spite of the fact that we all had different fathers, she gave us her last name. So we all have the same last name. Although my father was Richard Hill, and Tanya's father was Arthur Lee Harrison, and Renee's father was Vernon Smith. So she enforced familial connection. At the same time, as we grew older and we all grew to understand our more individualized histories, we realized that those enforced connections were in tension with the more individualized histories, because we have different health issues. You know what I'm saying? We have different understandings of who the father was or is, or what actually was, because they're all those men have passed away. And my mother had a habit of saying, when we would ask her about our fathers, she would become, really angry, and she would say things like, "I'm your mother and your father." Oh. And so that was my first understanding of gender, like, oh, this shit is fluid. She could be whatever she wants to be. Oh, okay. Okay. That was my first real lesson in being gender fluid. If I could use the contemporary language. And two, she made it clear that we were not to question not only them as parents, the fathers, but her as the head of the household. And so just in terms of your question, Miranda, yes, I think that we have this connection through our mother. And as we have grown up, we are also disconnected by that connection, because we were not allowed to really interrogate the places where we were different from each other.
Mhm.
But she could not let us do that and also hold us together as a family.
Is she still alive?
Yes, my mother turned 90 on February 5th.
Wow.
Yeah, yeah.
I was curious about the material evidence that you might have in possession for your sisters who've passed, particularly Renee, the kind that might be pictures or letters or something that says that they were here.
Those things are in my mother's possession
Mm-hmm.
currently, and when she passes, they will pass to me. I have a couple of pictures of Rosetta in my own possession.
Mm-hmm.
I have pictures of Tanya. I have the books that I gave to Tanya over the years, her and her children,
Mm-hmm.
that came back to me after she passed away.
Okay.
Unfortunately, my mother took care of the afterlives of Rosetta and Tanya and Renee, which meant she basically threw a lot of shit away.
Okay.
I know you don't want to hear that, baby.
It does.
Yeah, she basically threw a lot of shit away. I do know that she has stuff related to them because I've seen it. And in Renee's case, for example, Renee wrote apparently Renee wrote notes to God. Dear God, you know, I don't know why this happened today, or dear God, please help me pay the rent. And I asked my mother for those notes because I wanted to make a book out of them. And she refused me to have them.
Okay.
And I thought that was kind of odd because she and Renee weren't that close either. So I didn't understand why she was holding on to that material.
That was my question to you. I was wondering why she said no. Why you thought, what made you, what immediately came to mind about the refusal? You know, to turn
well, I think ultimately I came to understand that this was her child, and that she wanted to possess that memory in a particular way. And I knew that I would have to wait.
Okay.
I would have to wait because she has let me know that these things will pass on to me. I wasn't happy about that, but I mean, I couldn't cry and bitch about it because, as I said, Renee and I were not close, so I couldn't claim some emotional landscape that was more than her landscape as mother and child.
So I'm thinking about this idea that what you mentioned before, we're not really allowed, or maybe we don't take the space to express grief with and dissonance when it comes to our kin, right? Our relatives, maybe our mother, father, or siblings, and how powerful it is. I think those stories need to be told because every now and then I'll go to a service, someone's service, and someone will say, I wasn't very close to. And for me, I always felt that that was an honest thing because making saint people who passed away feels inauthentic.
Yeah.
You know, it feels like you're sort of sweeping or putting together a picture of someone for somebody else's benefit as opposed to really issuing your own complicated feelings around someone you grew up in a house with or someone that raised you, and you're like, well, here are these people, what do I say? And like I said, I've always felt that was really important for people to tell their stories, the honest stories, you know.
Yeah, and we've been raised as Black people in particular to not speak ill of the dead. So that notion that we cannot be honest about the dead also frames how we talk about those relationships.
Right.
Absolutely.
And also grief is complicated. A lot of people don't understand grief. And they don't understand how to grieve by themselves privately and publicly.
Yeah, this is true.
Very complicated.
I like that complication and that tension because I think it speaks to us, those of us who are here and speaking to each other in this way. And it also tells us about us, you know, about what we feel is appropriate. A lot of stories about people come out to me, or at least have happened to me when someone that's passed. But it's not
Mhm.
when they're at, at the funeral or the service.
Mhm.
It's outside of that. It happened to me with my mom. It happens to me with my sisters. And so, yeah, it's very, what do you call it? It's illuminating, a bit shocking sometimes.
Mhm.
Because you're dealing with all those feelings,
Mhm.
and
Mhm.
grief is, I like when you talked about that whole, you know,
Mhm.
because what I heard in that, I'm not sure if this is what you meant, it's simply a matter of fact. That
Mhm.
person is gone.
Right.
When you interact with that absence
Mhm.
is very unique and very personal. Do you know
Mhm.
that?
It's an absent presence.
Mm. Mm-hmm.
So then how do you deal with this absent presence as you go forward? My oldest sister identified as a lesbian.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so I got to talk with her about that a little bit in, life before she passed. But her whole community, when she passed, whatever her community was, it went with her. I never got to interact with her former lover or former lovers
Mm-hmm.
or friends. I mean, that all went away when she went away.
Mm-hmm.
And I had no idea who they were, and I wouldn't know who they are today. So there's a kind of absent presence
Mm-hmm.
around her queer life, what was for me a very queer death. So this notion of an absent presence is really
Mm-hmm.
also something that grief, as Miranda was pointing out, that grief engenders. And how do we as Black people allow grief to be grief as opposed to grief to be another narrative that we're telling,
Wow.
or another family story that we're telling?
Yeah, I mean, that's very hard because it's also just thinking about if you're, you sort of your situation growing up,
Mm-hmm.
different siblings and not having that connection.
Mm-hmm.
In that sense, even that is a sense of grief, or I would think
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
there's pain in
Mm-hmm.
that as well, and accepting that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think my family life today is on par with the pain that it was when I was growing up amongst them. I think one of the things I want to say around that is that the whole notion of talking about my family
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
makes me feel deeply vulnerable,
Okay.
because it means that I have to address, and I'm happy to, not happy, but I'm willing to,
Mm-hmm.
but it means addressing a kind of factitious reality, if you will, that continues to be painful.
Mm-hmm.
Family is a source of deep ambivalence and pain for me
Mm-hmm.
in this Black queer life I've been living.
Mm.
Mm. I could talk to you all day. And I think that we're going to have more conversations about this
Mhm.
offline. But I'd like to leave it there. I'd like to
Okay,
leave it there
love.
because I think it's
Mhm.
really powerful and beautiful. And thank you for allowing us, some time, for us as well as our audience to talk about
Mhm.
that fracturedness, that complexity and that nuance, and for being vulnerable. So we appreciate you coming
Mhm.
on the show today.
Thank you. Thank you, Stephen. Thank you, Miranda. And thank you for giving me a chance to air some of these feelings and states of being.